All right, let me just mention 3 books, and then we'll maybe move through and complete our lectures on the Sadducees and Pharisees, page 2 of your notes. But just 3 good books. If you want to read about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Herodians for that matter, this is a book, Jewish Contemporaries of Jesus, by Gunther Stempberger, and it's published by Fortress Press, and it's nice and small, but what I like about Gunther is he spends all of his time in the few original sources that we have that tell us about these groups. And Josephus is one of the main ones. Josephus had a spiritual awakening and decided, all right, I'm going to be spiritual. Who do I want to be spiritual with? And so he joined up with the Essenes for a while, which could have been part of the Qumran community. I think the Qumran community was almost more separatistic than Essenes. So the Qumran community I would call fundamentalist Essenes. And then there were Essenes who would still have stuff to do with the temple area, but felt that they were all hypocrites, which they were. And then the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Josephus ends up deciding that he likes the Pharisees or the Essenes the best. He dislikes the Sadducees, and the Pharisees are okay, but he thinks the Essenes are the best spirituality in his day. So this is an excellent book, short and to the point. Here's the one, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ by Harold Honer, where he gives you the whole chronology and works through the Gospels and different things in the life of Christ. And then the one that deals with all the historical background and the Herod people, Herod Antipas, contemporary of Jesus, and does an excellent job of going over all of the original sources that are available. So I'll set these over here later if somebody wants to glance at those. So let's just reinforce some things about the video that we saw. The biggest thing wrong with the video was the association of John the Baptist with the Qumran community or the Essenes, and he didn't come out of that. He came out of his own prophetic ministry, which God established for him, and he lived fairly much alone, and he didn't buy into that communal setting. All the theology, main theological tenets of the Qumran community would have been repugnant to John the Baptist and to Jesus. So that was the biggest thing in error. All the historical stuff and everything about Gamla and the Zealots and their fight is all very accurate by James Fleming. So any other questions or observations that you thought maybe something wasn't quite right in the video? Because I wasn't there to see it again. I've seen it so many times, but that's the only one that I remember, the big one that is incorrect. And I've never had a trip to Israel that I haven't had to correct the guys in a nice way, because they're all taught by James Fleming that this is the party line, so they all say the same thing, and so every year you have to say, well, I understand that that's what you've been taught, but this is where they differ, and the guys don't mind that. I mean, you do it in a polite and respectful way. So, and I tell them ahead of time that I'm going to do it. So, and they understand. So, all right. Well, let's look at just a little bit of the background. The Sadducees. As far as the background, generally speaking, people think that the term Sadducee comes from the Hebrew word Sadiq. Sadiq. S-A-D-E-K, some would say Z-A-D-E-K, but it's the word which means righteous. And the Sadducees thought of themselves as the righteous ones. As far as their background or history, the Sadducees, Josephus tells us, basically come out of the Hasmonean period of Judas Maccabeus and those rulers, and they were the aristocratic aristocracy was what I was looking for too. They were wealthy, they were influential, they were very, very political, and they enjoyed the status quo with Rome, and basically they were the minority party, but they controlled the temple area, which was the center of business and commerce and things like that. So they cooperated with Herod when they had to in order to maintain their influence over the temple area. But very, very corrupt in the sense of overcharging the people. They would have been in charge of switching out the money from Roman money to temple money. They only would produce so much temple money so that you were forced to pay high rates in exchange for it, because you couldn't give Roman money to the temple. Why? Because they had the picture of the Caesar on it. The Caesar is a god. And, God doesn't want your idolatrous money, so they would print up some nice sanctified money and coins that they would control. So, as far as their Josephus describes them as very boorish and pompous and kind of isolated to themselves. So when we get a chance to learn more about Jerusalem, they lived up in what we would call a gated community and had their own little road into the temple and would have very little to do with the common people.
What's the name of the community now?
Pardon me?
What's the name of the community?
The gated community? It's in the Zion quarter, or the Jewish quarter of the city of Jerusalem now. So they would have been called the Herodian palaces, is what they call them today. And maybe we might have a chance to see some on the video, but I certainly, those who are going to Israel, I want us to take a tour of some of these huge palaces that they had within the city of Jerusalem. As far as their teachings, of course, in the New Testament, they are most well known for their denial of the resurrection. They wanted only to hold to the strict Torah, or the laws of Moses. And they did interpret it quite literally. Sadducees would have been kind of like Arminian people today, very much heavy on free will and human responsibility. They weren't much for sovereignty or for faith, which the Pharisees were. Sadducees didn't believe in angels, good or bad. In their relationship to Jesus, we don't see the Sadducees interacting with Jesus as much as the Pharisees, but what we do see is that they are the majority, they are the ruling influence for the trials of Jesus. And they would have assembled that minimum quorum of 23 on the steps outside of the triple arches of the Hulda Gate area, and probably would have had that early morning trial. The Southern Archaeological Gardens, as they call them today, have been very successfully and extensively excavated, and Lord willing, we'll have a chance to walk up those steps and right there by the Hulda Gate and the Triple Arch Gate. So it's really a cool place. So that's the Sadducees. Pardon me?
That gate all closed off now?
Right.
Bricked in?
Yeah.
What's on the other side of that?
Actually, it goes up into the El Aqsa Mosque and up into the temple area.
And it's completely inaccessible to anybody, or?
Right. They like all the gates, Suleiman the Magnificent, in the 1500s when he conquered Jerusalem again, and the Turks took it away from the Crusaders in the 12 and 1300s. They rebuilt a lot of the walls, but gates that were there, they blocked them up because they wanted to control the access. Particularly, they blocked up the Golden Gate, which is also called the Eastern Gate, because they knew from Jewish theology that when the Messiah, the Prince, would come back, that he would come back and enter Jerusalem, across the Mount of Olives through the Eastern Gate or the Golden Gate. So when they rebuilt that area, they not only sealed it up more than any other gate, but then they started burying their dead outside the gate and all along the, what word am I looking for? All along the hillside there. Why would they bury all of their dead along the hillside? What was their thinking? Their thinking was that Messiah is forbidden to touch a dead body or to be in the presence of dead bodies, and so the idea was bury enough people and Messiah won't be able to come this way because he'll be unclean. The bad news is when Messiah comes, he resurrects them all for judgment. So,
could you give just a real quick kind of history lesson preview of like Jerusalem? I know how it's kind of split up between the, like you're saying, the Zionist quarter and then where you have the Dome of the Rock,
right,
whatever it's called, and like, you know, who has access to that today? So
sure, I've got when we do our section on the maps and everything, I'll go over the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Islamic quarter, the Catholic quarter. We'll go over all the different ones and the different influence of it. So, but the Temple Mount is primarily controlled today by the Muslims, and where the Dome of the Rock is where they think the temple was, but the temple actually was a little bit to the north of that. So, Lemire?
Yeah, question, Mark. Would you say that the Sadducees were the ruling party of the Sanhedrin?
They were the ruling party, the majority party of the Sanhedrin.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Not just on the trial of Jesus.
No, they were the ruling party. They were the wealthy influencers. So, let's talk about the Pharisees. The word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew word probably paresh, which means to be separate. And so that's probably the origin of the Pharisee. Now, some would suggest that the word paresh means to separate or to divide. Therefore, it also had the idea of to interpret. And so some would say they got their name Pharisee too because they were so zealous about the interpretation of the law. Josephus tells us that the Pharisees came out of a group that had its roots in what was called the Hasidim. And the Hasidim is another terminology for a separatist. And the idea was that they wanted to be holy. And in this holiness, their separation created all of this oral tradition of, dietary laws and washing laws and those kinds of things. So they had great political influence during the Hasmonean dynasty, but when the Hasmonean dynasty lost its influence and the Sadducees took over, then the Pharisees turned their attention to being popular amongst the people. And they were popular amongst the people because they weren't the rich and the wealthy, although they were probably whatever middle class or lower upper class existed in that day, they would have been the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were very helpful. I mean, they believed in alms, giving to the poor, honest temple worship. And so amongst the religious groups, they were very well liked by the people. So as far as what they believed, they had their oral law, their tradition of their own interpretations. And of course, again, it involved all those things that you see in the Gospels.
Along with that oral tradition, I know for one of the assignments we had talked about, the different conflicts between the Pharisees, and it says one of the last ones that the Pharisees bring against Christ was that they said he was going against the teaching of the elders.
Right.
Now, so that would have been one of their oral traditions.
Oral
that
traditions.
They created themselves.
Right.
That would have.
Yep. And primarily what we see in the book called the Mishnah, which is the compilation or collection of the Jewish teachings after the time of Christ. That is primarily all Pharisaic material. When Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 A.D., where are all the Sadducees? They're in Jerusalem. There aren't as many of them. And they are the power brokers of Jerusalem. So when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 A.D., the Sadducees are just wiped out. They are absolutely devastated. The Pharisees don't have their headquarters in Jerusalem. They are spread out amongst the people, but particularly up in the Galilee region. So after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., the Pharisees all move up to Galilee, particularly the city of Tiberias, and they start writing, and they have their scholarship, they have their schools, their yeshiva schools, which even today they call them yeshivas, and so their writings survive.
So where does a Jewish person today get their code of life?
Yeah, the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, and the conservative get theirs from the Pharisees, or from the Mishnah, and things like that.
Okay.
So,
More so than the Torah?
right. Oh, yes.
That's
The oral law is rules. See, the oral law becomes more important because the oral law is the correct interpretation of the written law. So, just like denominations today that will say, well, our tradition is more important than Scripture because our tradition is the correct interpretation of Scripture. And that's where they obviously get into troubles. So, let's see. So, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, of course, they butt heads with each other. Pharisees believed in a future life. They believed in a resurrection. Pharisees believed in free will, but they believed even more in the sovereignty or determinative fate of God. Free will was ultimately directed and controlled by God. So I mean, something like almost today, when people do stupid things, somebody would say something like, "Well, God made you do that because He's teaching you a lesson." Well, no, you just did something stupid, and God let you do it. Don't blame everything on God. So, yes, God will teach you a lesson through it, but don't blame Him. They also believed in angels, and of course, out of the Pharisees come the famous debates as to how many angels can fit on the pin of a needle and foolishness like that. Pharisees were interested in what we would call equality of all citizens, or equality of all people, or equality of humanity. When it comes to Jesus and the Pharisees, of course, we see them debating many things. The Pharisees were the most critical of Jesus, critical of the disciples. You don't wash your hands. What are you doing working on the Sabbath? What are you doing healing somebody on the Sabbath? You remember when Jesus is speaking to the people, he says, you ought to obey or listen to the Pharisees when they do what? When they are seated or sitting in the seat of Moses. Now, this is really a rebuke, or I don't know what. It's not sarcasm, but when they would sit in the seat of Moses, what would they be doing? They would be reading the Torah. Then they would get up and they would give the oral law. Or somebody else would give the interpretation. So when people challenge Jesus about, what's our relationship to the Pharisees, what he says to them is, well, listen to them when they're in the seat of Moses. Because it's when they're in the seat of Moses that they're actually reading the scriptures. The implication is, when they're not in the seat of Moses, you can forget about what they're saying. So it was kind of a cool way or a sly way of separating and rebuking them. Yes?
So basically he was saying if they were preachers, listen to them when they take their text and then forget the sermon.
Right. Forget the sermon. Listen to the reading of the word and forget the sermon. So,
did the video make a mistake? Because I thought he said that when Jesus spoke in Nazareth or whatever, he got up and read Isaiah, then he sat down and began to speak to the people in the seat of Moses. But I thought the video said,
Yeah, he did say that.
yeah.
so did he make a mistake, or does that mean that Christ's word he was trying to make a point that this is the word of God?
Well, for Jesus, sitting down in the seat of Moses and then teaching was the teaching of the authority.
Right.
So,
Yeah, so was Jesus making a point? That wasn't like the video made a mistake.
yeah, I don't recall particularly what he said. I'd have to go back on that.
Okay, just
So,
curious.
right, yeah. But the seat of Moses was the scriptures, and that was where the authority was to lie. So now, of course, in the one instance of Jesus, he stands up and he gives the reading, and you could stand up and give the reading, but then he sat down and he said, "What? Today, this is what? This has come to pass. This is fulfilled." Which he was drawing the relationship between the prophetic statement that he read and him being the prophet and the fulfiller of it. So, let's see. We're talking about what they are, Jesus and them. So, the Pharisees pulled the Sadducees in and the Herodians, and of course helped orchestrate his crucifixion. So the Sadducees wouldn't have been able to have riled the people up to the statements of, crucify him, like as much as the Pharisees would have. So next, 6a, the Essenes. I think the video did a decent job on the Essenes. In Hebrew here again, Esa means to do. And they, historically have suggested that the terminology of Essene refers to the doers, i.e. the doers of the law and the practicers of the law. You also have a Greek word, isas, which means to be holy. As far as the background of the Essenes, Josephus tells us that they were a very religious, devout people who left the status quo of Jerusalem to live in the desert. They rejected worldly pleasures. They rejected matrimony or marriage, which makes for a difficulty of kind of continuing on. So they didn't forbid marriage, but they suggested that there was a higher calling if you remained single. They didn't believe in mingling amongst society, so they wouldn't have participated in all of the Greco-Roman activities, and they held very strictly to the observance of the Sabbath. The Essene life was one of, I would say, simple as you could live. I would call it like a minimalist today. You only have one coat. You only eat the basic foods. They believed very much in the mikvah, daily washings. And they thought charity and acts of kindness were very important. They were socialists in that everybody had everything in common. Uh, 7a, the Zealots. As far as the Zealots, their name probably comes from the Greek word zelotes, which means zeal or to have great desire. And the Zealots were, I would say, in similar terms to like the militia that we have today in the United States, or even like the jihadists of they were so zealous for their religion and their politics that they were the military mind. And so their answer was, we've talked enough, it's time to go to war. So the Zealots would have been the Gamla people, the Masada type people. And understand this, their attitude was, if you ain't for us, then you're against us. The Zealots wiped out the Qumran community. When the Zealots took over Masada in 70, just prior to 70 AD, and they survived till 73 AD before Rome finally broke through, they wiped out the Qumran and the Essene community because they were afraid that if they still existed, the Romans would come along, enslave all of the Qumran Essene community, and make them the slave labor to build the ramparts to get into Masada. So they apparently approached the community and said, you got to join up with us and come. And they said, no, we're pacifists. We're not going to get involved. We're going to stay neutral. And they said, there's no neutrality here. And they wiped them out. Didn't kill them all, but they pushed them out of the area so that they couldn't be used against them. So, the Zealots were a group of, there were probably some Pharisees, some freedmen, some others, Essenes, that just got so fed up. These were the hotheads. The last one, it can be pronounced either Zakari or Sikari. We believe that they were another subcategory of the Zealots, and these were the assassins. Nowadays, we would call them the homicide bombers, or whatever. These were ones that were committed to assassinating powerful people, even at the cost of their own life. Samaritans. Briefly, their background. Where did the Samaritans come from? You remember in 702 BC, the 10 northern tribes go into captivity. 586, the southern tribes go into captivity. but some Jews are left behind in Samaria. Those Jews that were left behind intermarried with non-Jews. The Assyrians, particularly, their mindset was, how do you disrupt the culture of a people? You so force them to intermarry that they lose their culture. And so the Jews that were left behind from the captivities, particularly the 722 Assyrian captivity, the Assyrians imported all kinds of other people groups, quote unquote, forced the Samaritans to intermarry with them. And so when the Jews came back into the promised land under during the time of Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, and who was the third one? Zerubbabel. When they come back during those times, the Jews reject all the Samaritans because they consider them to be, spoiled. So that's kind of the background of the Samaritans. The Samaritans basically held to the Torah. They didn't accept a lot of the history of Israel, nor did they accept the prophets. They wanted to worship, as you know, in Gerizim instead of in Jerusalem. Believe it or not, there are probably, it's under 1,000, probably under 500 now, Samaritans still living and existing today. About 200 or 300 on the Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal area, what is modern day Nablus. They have their own temple up there. They still hold to the Old Testament sacrifices. They still offer the different sacrifices. I've been told and read that they are kind of a weak and sickly group. They are totally inbred. They're like, the Mennonite and others are, a big enough groups that they're not so inbred anymore. But they were so inbred over the years that they, just developed all kinds of physical problems and things like that. So,
The woman at the well, right?
Woman at the well is a Samaritan. Yeah, Jacob's well. Yeah, which is again one of those cool sites to visit. Although we won't be able to because it's in the part of the quote unquote West Bank, the northern West Bank around Nablus. But there's this ancient well there that has this long-standing tradition of being Jacob's well, and kind of a neat place to visit. So, as far as the Qumran community, 1947 is when they discovered the Qumran community and all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was good that they discovered it then because most all of those caves now have collapsed and completely dissolved due to erosion.
What year was that?
Pardon me?
What year was that?
1947 when they were first discovered. Well, when they were first publicly discovered. So, lots of great stories about the manuscripts and everything as to how they were hidden and those kinds of things. Probably the Qumran community did have a lot of contact or similarity with the Essenes. They've got their manual of discipline, which was the whole community rule. It's a wonderful site to visit, and we'll have a chance to do that. Qumran life was communal. They also suggested that you shouldn't be married, but if you were, that was okay. If you were married, that was good, but you didn't necessarily live with your wife. You stayed with the men. They were very big on the brotherhood, the Qumran brotherhood. As you know, they were very committed to all the scriptures, as we found manuscripts from all but, 2 or 3 of the Old Testament books. Song of Solomon was one. I think maybe Ecclesiastes was another one. I don't remember that off the top of my head. But they were very, very closed, tight community. Exercised a lot of peer pressure. upon people. Once again, the Qumran life was a very simple one, very basic necessities. When you saw where they lived, they chose the place where they lived because that was where the winter rains, the spring rains would come down out of the mountains and could fill up huge, huge pools and cisterns so that they would have water throughout the year. And it was an area of the desert where they would have the water trickling down. When we visit Wadi David or Ein Gedi, the spring of the goat, you'll see it's a typical example of even in the absolute heat of the summer, there are small waterfalls, small pools, small areas where water will run throughout the year. And of course, that's where you're going to park your community so that you've got water. You can import a lot of things, but not necessarily water. So people try to build a lot between the community of Qumran and the New Testament and John the Baptist, but all of that is really a bunch of bunk and nonsense. So I think we got a good enough idea as to the doctrine of the Qumran community. The most significant thing of the Qumran community, if you're not aware, is the fact that they were copying manuscripts in 200 BC of the Old Testament. Prior to the discovery of the Qumran community, the oldest complete manuscripts that we had of the Old Testament were from the 8th century AD. And people would always say, look, all you've got is 8th century manuscripts. You've got no idea whether these really represent the Word of God, whether these are really accurate. And when they found the Qumran community, they threw them back 1,000 years, and they were able to look and put them and say, you know, even the most critical scholar shut his mouth and said, you know what, these people did a phenomenal job of copying over, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years, accurately copying the Old Testament. And so the reliability of the Old Testament, even within the critical community, shot way up. And they had to kind of shut their mouths. All right, let's take